Michael Black is going to be doing the introduction. Michael is the one who was really the one who made it possible for our speaker to be here this evening. And Michael teaches neuroscience at Georgia State University. He is very active in the creation care movement and is a commissioned Earthkeeper in the United Methodist Church, and has been part of the planning team, and actually was the one in charge of the two big conferences. I don't know if it's more than this, but I know for 2015 and 2016 down in Decatur, Georgia. And so Michael, come on up and we'll let you introduce our speaker. Give Michael a hand.
Thanks, Paul. So those of you that know me know that I like to keep things short because it's all about the speaker. And you can give me a lot of credit for bringing Katharine, but Katharine is the reason that Katharine came. So thank you. Dr. Katharine Wilkinson is an author, strategist, and teacher working to heal the planet that we call home. Katharine's Vice President of Communication and Engagement at Project Drawdown, and the senior writer of the New York Times bestseller Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. I know that some of you came just because Katharine was coming to this conference. She holds that myth and legend and lives into it. Without further ado, Katharine Wilkinson.
I'm going to start with pink cheeks. Thank you, Michael. It's really so nice to be with you all tonight. I may move around a little so I can see all of you. It's an interesting moment that we find ourselves in here, obviously in Nashville, but as a society, as a human species, on a planet with incredible living systems that are under so much strain. It's such an interesting moment because so much is unraveling and so much is still possible if we choose to pursue it. And I think a lot about Parker Palmer's description of staying in the tragic gap. And I feel like that's pretty much Monday through Friday, also Saturday and Sunday for me. That it is so hard to be in a moment like this. When impacts are intensifying, we are watching the impact that the planetary functions are having on people's lives, and to still try to hold a vision of where we could go. This is really, really hard work. So I just wanted to sort of start by laying that out, because we're going to talk a lot about solutions tonight, but solutions don't go anywhere without solutionaries. And the work of being a solutionary is hard. And I suspect there's a lot of heavy emotion in the room for anyone who is kind of tracking the news on climate day to day. A little bit of context. This will be kind of the one science-y slide of the night. We're now hovering right around 415 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you know, it's sort of an abstract number, but the bottom line is that we've never lived on a planet like this. So human beings have never survived under the atmospheric conditions that we have already created. And we're continuing, right, to race upwards in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we're out of the norm for our species, much less others. And for those like me who are maybe less chart-oriented, I really love this visual of warming stripes. This is fundamental feedback to humanity, that the way we have been doing things is not working. And we need to turn things around and fast. And if we want to turn things around, we've got to be heading for drawdown. The point in time when that rising concentration of greenhouse gases stops ticking upwards and actually begins to decline year to year. This is really the critical threshold in terms of the future of our planet. It's really the point in time when we kind of head back towards what I think of as kind of a healthy heartbeat for the planet, right? I see that chart and it looks like an EKG that's gone sort of haywire, right? It's that relative steadiness and stability that has allowed human society to flourish. And what we need to be aiming for is some kind of return to relative stability. And we need to get there as quickly, as safely, and as equitably as possible. So that's where Project Drawdown tries to come in and do the work of essentially surfacing, understanding, and sharing the world's toolbox of climate solutions. We have spent the last few years really scouring humanity's wisdom for technologies and practices and approaches that are not someday, maybe if Elon Musk figures it out, sort of solutions, but things that are already proven, they're already working, they're in hand, economically viable, scientifically valid, they're ready to roll. And the reason that they find their way into our work at Drawdown is because they are already in the world and we know enough about their efficacy to have great data from which to make projections. So this is not, well, maybe we'll get there at some point, right? We know enough to act, and that's the line I'm going to take away from tonight. How many folks have encountered the work of Project Drawdown somewhere, somehow? Seen the book, heard a talk, peeked at the website? Okay, cool. So I'll just share a little bit more about us. We are a small, but I like to think mighty nonprofit that is a very tiny full-time team. And then we have had fantastic cohorts of research fellows that have come through and worked with us. So the work seems really big. We are actually very small. And when we did this work of trying to assess humanity's collective wisdom on climate solutions, we looked everywhere, right? We looked into every single sector of potential impact because we know there are no silver bullets when it comes to climate change. There are many sources of greenhouse gas emissions, many reasons why we're in this mess, and we need a whole bunch of solutions all working in concert to get us out of it. So this whole board of solutions is what you'll find in our work, and we're very excited. There's analysis currently underway on oceans-based solutions, which is really exciting. And we looked at not just the technologies that help us avoid sending greenhouse gas emissions up into the atmosphere, which of course are absolutely critical, but also the whole host of ways that we can actually bring carbon back home and into biomass and soil. It turns out that nature and 3.8 billion years of research and development has been incredibly effective for carbon capture and storage technology. Right, photosynthesis is super powerful. The Earth had carbon very well in balance until we started burning vast quantities of it and plowing up our soil with industrial speed. And this is what the solutions look like in a sort of dramatically simplified fashion. This is looking at how much emissions impact can each of these solutions have if scaled around the world over the next 3 decades. And this is the set of results from our most conservative, what we call our plausible scenario. What I think is really interesting about looking at them all together in this way is that you see something that actually looks a lot like nature, right? It's a super diverse mosaic of solutions. It's not 4 things or 5 things. It is a foothold of action, multiple footholds of action for every individual, every institution on the planet. So many ways in. And I think that can feel, in some ways, really overwhelming. Like, oh my, there's so much to do. But also, there's so much we can do, right? There are so many openings. And I find that one of the most kind of hopeful things about the work of Drawdown. And also that it's not just about super sexy technology. Certainly technology has a role to play, but it's also about farming and stewardship and human rights and equity. All of these things come together in the Drawdown solutions. And so we're going to be, yes, zipping to the future with innovation, but also dusting off ancient wisdom and reclaiming things that we once knew how to do, or, you know, in some places, and particularly indigenous cultures, are still done very, very well. It's just that many of us have lost our way. And so you'll see in Drawdown solutions that are kind of the usual suspects, which are incredibly important. You see here, again, in the plausible scenario, that onshore wind turbines come in at the number 2 solution. Solar farms have a huge role to play, but others that have gotten less attention than they deserve, because electricity generation is actually only creating 1/4 of our emissions. But we probably talk 90% of the time when we're talking about climate solutions about wind and solar, and right? But land use changes and agriculture also create 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. So things like forest protection and forest restoration are incredibly important. Reducing food waste is a huge opportunity. The food we waste creates roughly 8% of annual emissions. In this country, fully 40% of the food we produce never gets eaten. And this is a huge opportunity to address issues of food security and hunger at the same time as we're addressing a source of emissions. This was a surprise for most of us. Refrigerant management, clocking in at number 1 in this scenario. And again, these numbers move around a little bit depending on assumptions and this sort of thing. So, you know, don't hold too hard and fast to the rank order, but this is a really significant one. The hydrofluorocarbons, the refrigerant chemicals that are in our refrigerators and air conditioning units, they are a super potent greenhouse gas, 1,000 times or more as capable as carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. There's a lot fewer of them than carbon dioxide, but they really, really matter. And so this is just the opportunity to deal with leaks and disposal of HFCs better than we're doing now. And just for kind of a point of reference, so this is almost 90 gigatons of avoided emissions over 30 years. Last year, we emitted right around 37 gigatons of all greenhouse gases last year. So that's a huge number. Regenerative agriculture, another one that I think has gotten too little attention in climate discourse and investment and policy, but again, really powerful co-benefits of actually creating more resilient farms, a more resilient food system. And we know how much farmers are struggling and suffering right now, especially in the Midwest. And Michael and I know about what's the ongoing struggles of farmers in Southwest Georgia after Hurricane Michael. This is a huge one. And as you can see, a very, very small net cost for a really huge payoff for farmers. Almost $2 trillion of increased revenue for farmers with regenerative agriculture. And I'm just going to zip through. There are 100 solutions in the book. We're adding more by the day. Way too many to talk about. So I just want to kind of give you a bit of a sense of just how beautiful this mosaic of solutions is. I am a vegetarian, but I became very excited about silvopasture in the process of writing the book. Silvopasture is from the Latin for forest and grazing. It's just the integration of trees and livestock, basically. But what you end up getting is carbon sequestration that looks a lot more like a forest than a pasture. Pretty cool. Women smallholder farmers is another one. There's a gap in what they call productive inputs for male smallholder farmers as opposed to female smallholder farmers. Access to seeds, access to capital, land rights, training, extension support, you name it. And when you close those gaps, yields on existing plots of land rise. So same garden, same field, more food. So you end up having a positive ripple effect on avoiding deforestation while also, again, improving food security, improving household income, livelihoods. It's a powerful one. We looked not only on how we produce food, but also what happens on the other end of the food chain, shifting diets to less meat and more plants, which turns out to have huge benefits for health, which translates into huge amounts of money. We talked about reducing food waste. We also looked at the impact of composting or processing our organic waste through digesters, anaerobic digesters that are small or large, the adoption of clean cook stoves. Land, we mentioned, there's a whole suite of ecosystem-related solutions that are incredibly exciting, protecting and restoring peatlands, protecting and restoring coastal wetlands, both areas that are super dense in carbon, but also very effective at sequestering carbon. Mangroves are amazing. Also really helpful for buffering coasts against storm surges and the like. Indigenous peoples' land management is another that kind of cuts into the human rights side of our work. Very simple, where land is managed by Indigenous communities and protected by Indigenous communities, forests sustain. And of course, that ends up having an impact on emissions. So there are a lot of co-benefits to these solutions, but for a lot of them, emissions are just kind of one outcome that is fantastic, but isn't the reason that we should be pursuing these things, right? It's a positive ripple effect, but it's not why, right? We should be ensuring Indigenous land rights and sovereignty because it's a human right, and because it protects culture and societies. We talked a little bit about electricity. We looked at both utility scale and distributed, so household solar as well as solar farms. Really, what's critical also in electricity is that you have to have a more flexible grid, a smarter grid, and you have to deal with the issue of storage because the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. So these, I think, often get too little attention, but they're kind of the critical, I don't know, what would you call them, like supporting actors, I guess, for moving to 100% clean and renewable energy. Buildings in the US are responsible kind of in their whole life cycle for roughly 40% of our emissions in this country. Really great opportunity when we build new to build super efficient and maybe even in ways that our net zero energy use, net zero emissions creation. But we also have a huge need for retrofitting. I don't know if anyone's been to Ponce City Market in Atlanta. That was a massive retrofitting project that was completed a few years ago. There are at least 1.5 trillion square feet of existing building stock that we need to bring into the 21st century, which is a daunting number. But again, I think this is an exciting area for job creation. This is going to be a critical piece, I'm sure, of what gets proposed in the Green New Deal. Anyway, a lot of exciting things here, and again, an area with very clear payoff, right? You invest some money up front and you save a lot of money in the long term. Transport. Lots of solutions around making sure that we're able to keep the social good of mobility or even increase the social good of mobility, but do that in a way that's lower in emissions, but also is more equitable, is less car-centric, and moves us into cities and spaces that are better for humans, right? That are more walkable, they're more beautiful, they're healthier. Lots and lots of exciting co-benefits here as well. Materials is a tricky space because there are some things that we use a lot of that are a problem. Cement being one of them, steel being one of them, and of course plastic being one of them. So we looked at means of shifting towards better or alternative cements, bioplastics where that's appropriate, a whole host of recycling related solutions. So really, how do we use better materials, and how do we start to create circular flows of those materials? How do we start to move towards a circular economy? And then there's a sector of our work that we call Women and Girls, which is really about the ways in which gender equity ends up also being a climate solution. Gender equity is entangled with climate in really two essential ways. One is that while negative impacts of climate change are touching everyone, they hit women and girls first and hardest, especially under conditions of poverty. That's the not good side of the story. The happier side of the story is that in moving forward on fundamental rights of women and girls, we also end up having a positive ripple effect on emissions. We already talked about women smallholders, but also educating girls and securing access to high quality, voluntary reproductive health care and reproductive justice are really, really important. There has been for way too long, and I continue to hear this term far too much in environmental circles, the idea of population control, which is just, if you've used it, just let it go tonight. Anytime we're talking about controlling the choices that women are making about their bodies and their families, we're entering into super, I will avoid using an expletive territory, not good territory. What our work focuses on is that in moving forward on fundamental rights, on more choice, on more opportunity, we actually achieve the outcomes that quote unquote population control is looking for, but we do it in a way that's grounded in the autonomy of women and girls, in ways that allow them to have more choice about their life. And of course, again, this is not why girls should go to school. This is not why women should have access to family planning and reproductive health care. It's just one positive outcome of that. And it turns out that moving forward on gender equity is on par in terms of emissions impact with solar and wind and forests and regenerative agriculture. Sometimes people say, like, well, why has this not been part of the climate conversation? And I think part of that has been the incredibly problematic history around population control, but also that so much of the discourse about climate solutions has been shaped primarily by white men. And so I think we have overlooked some areas that have a huge role to play, and that we've been missing out on. But of course, that's not where the role of women and girls in climate stops, right? That is actually a very small piece of the puzzle in my perspective. We are seeing such incredible catalytic leadership from women and girls on climate around the world, often with approaches that sort of break with the status quo, super creative, collaborative, compassionate. It's really, really inspiring, especially to watch these young women in their teens and early 20s just operate in such powerfully connected and community-driven ways, and to speak with so much moral clarity in a way that we just has been very hard to break through, I think, in the public discourse. I love this quote. This is from Greta's TED Talk. "The climate crisis has already been solved. We have all the facts and solutions. All we have to do is wake up and change." And in some ways, that's very much the theory of change of Drawdown, that we actually have the solutions. We have the tools that we need. What we have got to do is put them to work faster and at greater scale than we have been doing, and to ensure that in bringing these solutions into greater prominence and greater fruition, we do that in a way that benefits everyone, that actually helps us to amend some of the other systemic challenges that we're grappling with. I don't think that it is hyperbolic to say that this will be the most pivotal decade in human history. The science is very, very clear about this. It's not that 12 years from now, it's all over, right? That we will have either fixed it or not. That's not accurate. But we need to be digging so deep and moving so fast, and bringing in everyone that we can get to join us. You know, a friend of mine likes to say, to change everything, you need everyone. And we really are, we're faced with the task of changing everything. And again, there's a daunting aspect to that, but to me, there's also a deeply meaningful and purposeful aspect to that, which is that we are alive in this incredibly pivotal moment, and creating a living and livable future. That really is the mission of the human species in this moment. That is our reason for being, to build a bridge from where we are now to the world that we want to leave to our children and grandchildren and their children and grandchildren. So much is unraveling, but so much is still possible if we choose to pursue it. And it does feel like a great waking up is finally happening. It has felt, I think, for a long time that there were like little awakenings happening in certain corners, but it is coming into the mainstream in a different way. When you overhear conversation about climate and insurance policy, from like 20-somethings in a bar, that something has shifted. I really, really hope that we see that, especially coming into the 2020 elections, because we really don't have a moment to lose. So I will just leave us with a question, which is one that Greta's talk and her kind of continued moral leadership leaves me with, which is, what does being awake mean to me, for all of us, right? If that's the work, to wake up and change, to invite others into waking up and change, what does that mean, and how do we live into it? How do we really participate in the community of life in this moment? And I don't think it's a question that has a simple or a definitive answer. Probably the number one question, well, maybe the number one question is there hope? And the number two question is, what should I do? And the truth is that there's just not a simple answer to what should I do. And simple answers to that question, I think, are actually, in some ways, they're a little bit offensive, because we actually need people stepping into this work in all of their power, with all of their talents that they can bring to this. And telling people, ride your bike and don't fly and cut out the burgers, we need so much more than that. Those things are all good, and they're all ways to get grounded in our values and start to live into the world that we want to realize. But I want folks coming in to this work to contribute in ways that I couldn't possibly imagine, right? I have a really dear friend who's a human rights lawyer, incredible woman, and I was like, Jen, we have to have you on climate. You have to help us. I didn't know what she should do. And the next thing I know, she's working with Vanuatu on a legal strategy for small island states. And she's taken on a case in the UK that just had a big win against fracking, that the government hadn't taken into account the climate impacts of fracking and overturned that law. That's not on a top 10 list, right, for what can you do about climate. But these are the kinds of stories I think we need to be telling. And so many people are joining this work and figuring out, how do I redeploy my time and my talents and my resources to make an impact? And so I just want to leave us kind of all with the task of seeking out those stories and lifting up those stories and sharing them, because this is about meaningful, purposeful work in the world. It's not just about going to the grocery store with canvas bags. It's about coming into a togetherness and a collective that the environmental movement, I think, has not fostered often enough. And I can't think of a better place to do that than in faith communities. So I love what you all are doing here. I'm really excited that you're laying concrete plans. I will be asking Michael for updates. And I just hope it's an incredibly fruitful few days together in community and relationship, and cooking up some big collaborations for the future. I'll leave it there.